I think we could start. Um, Thank you for all joining us the very final day of this 3-day long symposium on Taiwanese photography. The final day is the longest day for the panelists, and we have wonderful sessions with the scholars, photographers, and curators, and also the roundtable with the two renowned curators at the end. So I'd like to introduce Meg Jackson-Fox, the moderator of the first session today. Meg Jackson-Fox is Associate Curator of Academic and Public Programs at the Center for Creative Photography. Dr. Fox specializes in modern and contemporary art and history, time-based art practices, interdisciplinary visual education. She holds an MA in Modern European History from the University of Tennessee, an MA in Art Business and Museum Studies from Georgetown University, jointly convened with the Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. And she holds a PhD in Contemporary Art and Critical Theory from the University of Arizona. Previously, Dr. Fox was assistant professor of global art history at the University of Denver. Meg's research base is expressly transnational, with publications in Germany, Italy, Poland, Great Britain, and the United States. She is concurrently finishing work on an interdisciplinary curatorial project, Trister in their Lives, a collaboration with the University of Arizona's Laboratory for Trilling Research. For the Center for Creative Photography, as well as her first book project titled Movements, Essays on Art, Running, and the Body. Please, Meg, it's over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. And I'm delighted to moderate our first panel this evening or this morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. And the panel is called Taiwanese Photography in a Global Scene. And to introduce our 4 panelists, beginning with Dr. Shuxia Chen, who will speak on picturing a psychic world of 1980s Taiwan. And I'll introduce each panelist at the time of their discussion, then anticipate conversations and an opportunity for your questions and comments nearer to the panel's end, and you can drop those in the chat or the Q&A. Of course, you're welcome to do that along the way as well. We'd be happy to have those, and I'll gather those up and we can address those at the end. And Dr. Kim, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, so forgive me if I'm repeating it, but just so that everyone knows, there's an interpretation button at the bottom of our Zoom screen, and you can choose which language is most befitting for you. So just have a click on that and make those selections. And with that, I'll introduce Dr. Shuxia Chen, who is an art historian and curator of Asian art. Her research concerns the relationship between visual art, society, and politics in China, particularly the role of photography in forming new understandings of the transversal space between state and the cultural intellectual classes in the socialist and post-socialist era. Dr. Chen is working on 3 book projects, including an edited volume, A Home for Photography Learning, The Friday Salon, 1977 to 1980. She is currently lecturer of curating and cultural leadership at the University of New South Wales and curator at the China Gallery Chow Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Chen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Fox, for your kind introduction. And good morning here from Sydney. And thank you, Dr. Ji-Hei Kim from the University of Arizona, as well as the Center for Creative Photography for organizing such an interesting and timely symposium. Thank you, the interpreters here, for your wonderful work for the last 2 days. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm journeying from the unceded land of Gadigal and Wango people. I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and extended that respect to all Aboriginal peoples today here in American, Australia, and Taiwan. The paper is roughly a summary of a still work in progress chapter in a book project on Taiwanese photography during the martial law period, co-edited with our fellow panelist here, Dr. Olivier Krischer. So I would like to extend my thanks to Australia Centre on China in the World at Australia University, Australia National University, as well as Ministry of Education, Taiwan, to make this book project possible. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen, and then I will start my presentation today. The 1980s, Taiwan saw simmering debates on Taiwanese identity toward a nativist turn in histories and cultures. The increasing attention paid to mental health among educated public amid Taiwan's peak industrial growth had demonstrated an individualistic and internal aspect of such identity development. Through examining the photographic series Longfatang, a Buddhist temple for people living in a mental illness, living with mental illness by Ho Chonghui, and Lian Huiling's darkroom manipulated images for Teacher Chang, Zhang Laoshi Yuekan magazine, the first popular psychology magazine in Taiwan. This paper shares preliminary research on a significant role photography had played in visualizing and decoding the unknown psychic world of and to a growing urban population towards the end of the martial law period, as a significant yet often neglected aspect of Taiwanese self-searching journey or identity searching journey. Having spent time at the asylum in 1981, when he was suffering from depression, Ho Chonghui's Longfatang series processes an insider's perspective on psychological state of patients and the facilities on orthodox treatment of training patients together. Such practice of Longfatang had caught great controversy after various media reports. With his previous experience as a patient, Ho became a member of an investigation team on Longfatang, headed by Dr. Wen Rongguang from First Department of Psychiatry at the Hospital of Kaohsiung Medical University in 1982. At that time, Ho Chonghui was also supported by Dr. Wen running the Cactus Cafe, the first cafe in Taiwan that run by discharged mental patients. Ho Chonghui joined Dr. Wen's investigation team and documented patients in Longfatang, borrowing a single lens reflex camera and a wide angle lens from his customer. During that time, he was, this is some of the work, during that time, he was interviewed by Le Delay, Li Da Xingyuan, a medical magazine published by Cyanamid Corporate for the service of Taiwanese physicians, where Chen Yingzhen was the editor-in-chief. And Chen invited Ho to publish his Longfatang photos when Renjian magazine was established in 1985, but Ho Chonghui rejected. And Ho Chonghui never gave this photograph to Dr. Wen for the project as well. The photos eventually first published as a book, edited by Zhang Zhaotang under a series called Aspects and Vision, Taiwan Photographers in 1989. So you could see here, this is the collection of Ho Chonghui's photograph within this series. And also the work was first actually included in the exhibition, also curated by Zhang Zhaotang, called Seeing 9 Perspectives from 9 Taiwan photographers in Taipei, then toured to San Francisco in 1991. Despite Ho Chonghui had no formal photography training, he had a very acute eye and an unconventional eye on depicting his subject, conveying his own experience in the dynamic, candid way he photographs the patients with an unsettling sense of movement produced by slower shutter speed and his unsteady camera. The life-size prints exhibited later we actually produced a quite life-size print, offer an intense encounter with the object and the somber, endless space of the asylum. The graphic distortions in these images, which enhance the effect, actually result from mold and other damage, as Ho did not develop the film until 2 years later it was shot. The Longfatang series is the document of an asylum that is no longer operating. But like much of Ho's later work for Renjian magazine, it also offers a glimpse of the darker, unsettling aspects of Taiwan's decades of rapid growth. Around similar time when Ho was documenting Longfatang for the professional medical magazine, the first Taiwanese popular psychology magazine, Teacher Zhang, Zhang Laoshi, was established in 1981 to raise public knowledge on mental health. Established from a mimeograph newsletter on mental health funded by China Youth National Salvation Corps for the Youth Counseling Center. A quick note here about the China Youth National Salvation Corps, for those who are not familiar with the history. It was a quasi-governmental, quasi-political organization established by Jiang Jingguo in 1952 as part of the Political Welfare Bureau. Originally, it was set up to train youth for the nationalist army. From 1970s, it was disassociated with the Warfare Bureau and focused on organizing lecture activities and counseling service to mainly secondary school students. Its counseling service to high schools included newspaper, newsletter, and a national network of film service. So this magazine, Teacher Zhang, was established under such service offered by the Youth Counseling Center. It was this semi-official status that Teacher Zhang could be established, even though the press ban was still in place during the 1980s, the last decade of the martial law. More importantly, in addition to the existing networks of the CYC, which is the Youth National Salvation Corps, the need to professionalize psychologists, especially clinical psychologists, had emerged from mid-1970s when Taiwan was under rapid industrialization and urbanization. Such dramatic transition had caused various alienation and displacement within the cities. We could also see why alternative religious treatments provided by temples such as Longfatang were popular for families in despair. The lacking of professional counseling service has caught attention of experts mainly worked in government and university research institutions. Teacher Zhang was established to respond to such demand. It aimed to be a popular psychology magazine with urban general public as their targeted readers. Its editor-in-chief, Dr. Yu Dehui, was at that time was a PhD student on clinical psychology at Taiwan University, formed a small voluntary crew at its early years. To make it more approachable to non-professionals, Dr. Yi and the small editorial committee appropriated some strategies from the American popular psychology magazine, Psychology Today, as well as Life magazine, to focus on local psychological issues with humanistic storytelling, combining photographic images and illustrations. Photography had played a significant role in visualizing the complex mental issues to an audience who were new to such concepts. Longfatang, a widely debated social issue, were also featured twice in Teacher Zhang, very different from Ho Chonghui's subjective and blurry, candid approach. Photograph on Longfatang, published in this newly established popular psychology magazine, were somehow journalistic yet sympathetic, coupling with articles written with storytelling style, quite sentimental, self-reflexive, yet objective, supported by research data. For example, for this 1984 article was based on the findings of Dr. Wen Rongguang's research project, which Hou Chonghui was involved as a photographer. While most, so this is in 86, a more sort of lengthy, with more images, photo. It really looked like photo essay here, by written and also photographed by Zhou Benji. Due to the time limit, I won't expand the practice here. While most of the photographs were taken in the field, like this one, that really sort of a few years investigation and sort of taking photos when the reporter or the journalist was there, it was really difficult to source appropriate photographic images that reflected on those psychological problems or issues. There were some stock image services available at the time with very limited option on what image one could buy. So Lian Huiling was recruited by the magazine specifically for photographic image making. Lian joined Teacher Chang in 1982 as a volunteer. At the time, she just graduated from Shuxia School of Journalism, now the Shuxia University, studying printing and photography. However, photography course at Shuxia School of Journalism only taught techniques. While working for Teacher Chang, she had audited photography classes of Wang Xin at the Shuxia School, who made her name for her long-term documentation of Taiwan's indigenous peoples, as well as sat in Wu Jiabao's classes at the Taiwan Art School, now the National Taiwan University of Art, where she had, where Lian Huiling told me in an interview that she had learned more humanistic and diverse approaches. What kind of images would help tell a story on mental issues to an audience who might have lived experience but were new to the subject and did not know how to articulate it? To help demonstrate different psychological states for the magazine, in addition to conventional journalistic photographs, Lian used darkroom techniques to manipulate the image to better visualize the story. With support from the editors and also 9,000 Taiwan dollars she earned from a commission work, Lian bought an enlarger and set up a darkroom in the office of Teacher Chang. In this darkroom, Lian had produced many she called designed images for the magazine between 1982 and 1987. Basic darkroom techniques such as overlaying, multiple negatives, dodging, and burning were used to experiment a surreal effect for the magazine. For example, in an article about pressure, Lian staged and took a photograph of her friend, which you could see on your right, half naked and choking her own neck. In her darkroom, she cut off the face in one copy of the photograph, then gently moved the cut off face shape above the face on another copy of the photograph to create a growing effect covering the unturned head. The light created by such dodging darkroom technique has obscured the facial expression, in a way give the space for viewers to imagine and associate with her struggle in the darkness of pressure. Another common darkroom technique has been used by many photographers to create special effects is to overlay different negatives to produce composite photograph, like Lang Jingsan's famous Chinese ink painting, which our keynote Professor Liao had mentioned at the first day of this symposium. However, what Lian produced was not to mimic traditional aesthetic or for a nationalistic approach, but to design appropriate images to popularize psychology to general audience. Her designed images, not unlike Lang's composite photograph, started with collecting materials by photographing staged scenes acted by her colleagues and friends. Then she overlaid the negatives of these materials in darkroom. The image here showed on the left, the spirit of of a woman looking at her own self lying in bed. On the wall hanging a picture of Jesus looking on both of the spirit and the body. Such strong religious reference was one of the magazine's long-term investigation on the relations between psychotherapy and religions, including traditional Taoist and Buddhist belief, for example, the Longfatang investigation, and relatively new religions such as Christianity. The role of sign here, the role of sign language for children with autism. So the report on the right, you can see, is part of this special issue on children's mental health or children's development, mental development issues. We could see such technique also used. This is the 1982 issue, so Lian Huiling only just joined the magazine. So we could see the composite photograph that she produced for this article, which I have a better image here, is you still see that the technique is still raw and new, but she took a photograph of her friend's daughter, her colleague's daughter, and then also sort of putting different layer of image, negative of image together, which you could see that is not as mature as her later images, which like the line on the left side of the palm, which is she still hadn't managed to cover. But that really sort of gives you an idea of her design image that using darkroom techniques really had helped visualize common yet complex psychological issues in the 1980s Taiwan. She left Chichachang in 1987, a few months before the official lifting of the martial law in Taiwan. She joins the China Times Weekly as one of their few female photojournalists. At the time, emerged many street protests. She worked along with a new generation of Taiwanese photographers such as Gao Chongli, Hou Chonghui, and Ye Qingfang, who shared a career as a photojournalist, yet at the same time started consciously producing individual works. It could be the influence of producing images for a psychology magazine. Lian Huiling's work subconsciously explore inner psychic state of mind, offering a distinct perspective on society at the time. She believes that photography not only represents things that are visual, it makes things visible. In contrast to most of her peers who focused their attention on representing local people and landscapes, Lian had an acute eye for animals which often were not seen by people, portraying them in an unconventional, sentimental ways. Here we could see a gentid cat and a wide-eyed that pig killed or to be roasted as a ritual offering, and the strange juxtaposition of an this alert guard dog in distance when a young girl's blurred face in the foreground. Such fleeting moment just glimpse out of the corner of her eyes, yet perfectly reflect through the camera lens. I particularly like this photo. The huge yet blurry young girl's face occupies the center of the image, yet the focus is on the small images on an old lady on the left and a dog on the right. Such composition replicated our perception of consciousness through the camera, a machine, a mechanical process, and also created a filmic sensation of being in that street, a young girl walking by right in front of us, yet our attention is on the dog barking at the old lady in distance. Such preference reminded us of Daido Moriyama's works here, as well as some work such as, you can see the comparison, and some other Moriyama Daido's work, on street and animals, in particularly that he's a stray dog. in the post-war Japan, the similar high contrast and raw images shared by Lian, depicting the everyday street scenes totally different from the protest she would have photographed as a journalist in the post-martial law Taiwan. All familiar domestic animals lived or dead. Lian notably pictures them at their eye level, conveying a complex pathos and uneasiness, or simply raw life beyond well-rehearsed cultural and political narratives. Amid the traditional realists, I'm just, sorry, probably my time to finish, I'm just quickly wrap up. Amid the traditional realist and modernist approach of photography at the time, in the 1980s Taiwan, both Hou Chonghui and Lian Huilin's work captured and exposed the shadowy psychic presence towards the end of an era, yet the emergence of psychological magazines and attention to the mental health issue had provided an outlet for urban dwellers to learn, debate, and continue the journey of self-searching. Thank you so much. I'll just stop sharing.
I'll now introduce our third panelist, and that is Dr. Olivier Krischer, whose presentation today is entitled Curatorial Notes on Tsai Hu Feng and the Documentary Image in 1960s Taiwan. Dr. Olivier Krischer is a historian of modern and contemporary East Asian arts with a particular interest in transcultural networks and photomedia. Following his PhD in art history at the University of Tsukuba, Japan, he has been a postdoctoral fellow at the Australian National University and a visiting fellow at the Academic Sinica, Taiwan. He is author and editor of What's in a Name After Orientalism, and Asia Through Art and Anthropology, Cultural Translation Across Borders. His curatorial projects include Wailang Te, A Bridge, Wayfaring, Photography in 1970s, 80s Taiwan, Zhang Palier, From Painting to Video, and Between, Picturing 1950s and 60s Taiwan. He currently lectures in Asian art at the National Art School in Sydney and is convener of the Sydney Asian Art Series at the Power Institute for Fine Arts, University of Sydney. Thank you, Dr. Krischer, for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Meg. I'd also like to extend my thanks also to Jihei and start by acknowledging as well that I'm also on the unceded lands of the Wongal and Gadigal people here in Sydney and sort of southwest Sydney. Thank you to everyone over the last couple of days. I haven't been able to join all the sessions, but all those I've been able to join have been really fascinating. In the interest of time, I'll get into my paper, which is a little bit different. When I saw the invitation from Jihei, I thought, given the title of this session, that it might be interesting to talk about the curatorial experience working with Taiwanese photography over the last few years. And so I recognized also that there's a considerable amount of research on Taiwan photographic history in recent years, and it's with its complex history and identity. One striking aspect, I think, of this work in Taiwan in particular is its notably self-reflexive approach. So interrogating the terms and conditions of its formation is one of the aspects of Taiwan photo history that I think is particularly productive. On day one of the conference, for example, we heard Tsai Jiaoyi from NCPI speaking about the center being open to multiple perspectives, even while it retains the basic mission of identifying, defining, and preserving Taiwan photo history. Also in the introduction to Zhang Shulun's recent aptly titled book, Reclaiming Reality, on Taiwan photo history, he argues for approaches that maintain the sort of multiplicity or fragmentary condition of Taiwanese photo history and the potential histories that this condition makes possible. So it's in that spirit that my paper today takes the form of a critical reflection on curating some works of Taiwan photography and how working spatially with these images has shaped my questions and research regarding the experience of photography in Taiwan. I'm interested not only in what photography captures of Taiwan's particular history, complex history, of course, but also how the experience of photography in Taiwan might add to how we think about the photographic medium. I will there. Last year in 2021, I was co-curator with Dr. Shuxia Chen for the exhibition Wayfaring, Photography in 1970s, 80s Taiwan. This exhibition was held at the Australian National University Centre on China in the World, featuring 35 works by 12 artists. And most of that work was from the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts in Taichung, who we gratefully acknowledge have been very supportive. And we also had additional new prints from Lian Huiling as well as Xie Chunde. As works almost all produced between the 1970s and 80s, they of course bear witness to the complex impact of the martial law era on society and the individual. But the exhibition aimed not to present an overview of photography, but to argue, that there was some kind of collective resistance, but rather our selection of works in exhibition design tried to highlight the sheer diversity of photographic practice at this time. And we really saw that as one of the aspects that we wanted to focus on in the exhibition, despite the modest space. Our approach was to select a few works for each artist, mostly drawn from larger series or bodies of work, to emphasize the important shift that had occurred from the 1960s, which will be the topic of my talk as I get into the paper today. So this shift is from the dominant salon style of discrete moments to visual series circulated as photo essays in exhibitions, but particularly publications. The exhibition title Wayfaring refers to the term Zhaolu, which was the Chinese title for the exhibition. And that's a term used by John Thomson, whose work, of course, many of you will recognize here on the right, to describe what photographers, including himself, were doing at the time. And we also included these works, which many of you will know are from the mid-1960s, to trouble this neat division in decades. Despite using it to sort of structure our title, we pushed against what the 1960s or 70s really mean. Literally meaning to search, zhao, for a path or a way, lu. This title lyrically evoked both the actual journeys that artists undertook to photograph an increasingly diverse idea of place and people in Taiwan, as well as their introspective searching for new ways forward through photographic exploration. Importantly, and here you see the work of Wang Xin, which was set next to Zhang Zhaotang's as a pointed contrast. So importantly, we found that these pathways often intersected and mingled, muddling our idea of genres. So documentary images could present powerfully subjective statements, and then on the other hand, furtive, surreal, or apparently absurd photography, photographic visions made often tangible, shared yet largely unspoken realities. The exhibition included also the work of, that you can see here on the right, for example, Jian Yongbing, Xie Chunde on the left. You see some examples here from a series in 1985, Ye Qingfeng. And on the larger wall, some of the work that Shuxia Chen had spoken about earlier in our panel, Hou Conghui, as well as Lian Huiling and He Jingtai and Gao Zhongli. Gao's work in particular, which was the latest work produced in the exhibition, intentionally suggested a kind of echo or loop with the work of Zhang Zhaotang and the picturing of the body, and really the centrality of the body to all these works as forms of portraiture. But I think the way that Gao pictures the body also challenges what we think of as portraiture. And we wanted to underline actually his background as a sculptor, as an art student, with this installation of his work. When invited to present for this conference, considering history and practice, I realized that many of my questions regarding photography in Taiwan have developed through this experience, this curatorial experience, and particularly an earlier exhibition from 2015, which this exhibition Wayfaring from last year sought to develop or build on. And that's the focus then of my talk today. In 2015, I curated the exhibition Between, Picturing 1950s-60s Taiwan, also at the Australian National University, and it featured 44 artworks, all from the National Museum of History in Taipei. So it was quite interesting to hear Dr. Liao's talk. This was from a period just before he had assumed the directorship a couple of years before. The exhibition background and parameters are not unconnected to the conditions that encouraged what the final selection of works would become. So I'll say a little bit about this process. There was actually an agreement between the National History Museum and the Research Centre to collaborate on some kind of exhibition. And the content and parameters, however, were entirely open. And that was part of my remit as curator of the Research Centre's exhibition space. So in terms of Taiwan's social history and art history, I was interested already in the 1950s and 60s as being the immediate post-war, the earliest decades of martial law, the Cold War, for example, but also a time in which art historically, I felt new institutions and cultural policies were asserting themselves. Artists who had learned from or navigated European, Chinese, or Japanese art institutions and materials were all active and forming this art world. And I was curious to see how this was or wasn't reflected in the museum collection, distinct from secondary literature. I worked with the National Museum of History's curator and art historian, Shuxia Chen, who I gratefully acknowledge here for her help and collegiality over the years. And we worked to refine the loan possibilities in terms of works that might be available and practical, with my guiding principle being the 50s and 60s. So in addition to photography, I was also drawn to the museum's collection of other works on paper, including prints, watercolors, even drawings or sketches. So some of which were considered actually archival materials rather than artworks, and therefore they had never been exhibited before. So for example, this sketch on the left here by Zhao Dai, an artist that some of you may know, an artist and a poet, better known for oil, work in oils, for example, portraiture. This had never really been exhibited as an artwork, and some of the work, including this other sketch on the bottom left, you can see it had been damaged, and there was one other work that actually couldn't travel because of its poor condition. So I found these objects interesting because they reflected the condition of the collection and the way that things had come in, and said something, I thought, about the way that photography had also come into the collection. By considering all works on paper with a focus on photography, it created an interestingly broad set of works that shared not only their relative dimensions or materiality, but also motifs or subjects to which I became more sensitive as I began to curate them into the space. This approach also combined works by well-known artists with some by virtually unknown or amateur artists, whose work had found its way into the collection with little documentation on their provenance or accession. So for example, here we see a sort of contrast between Cai Huifeng's work, the photographer who I'll discuss at more length in a moment, and Cai Huichun. I don't know if there's any relation. It's tempting to think that there's some relation because of the similarity in their names, but there's no documentation about this watercolor, which, as many of you will probably recognize, it to me reflects the legacy of Japanese watercolor, particularly in amateur circles in Taiwan. And I found those sorts of palimpsestic histories of art history, colonial history, social history, documenting change, rural to urban sort of change alongside photography. I found that those sorts of layers to be particularly interesting in the space. As such, the exhibition was to some extent a snapshot of a particular collection, since the museum's collection seems to respond to the twin needs to be custodians of both art and cultural history. And I think that this also structures some of the history making around Taiwanese photography. I'll return to this point when discussing Cai Huifeng's photos, which were, for example, collected to illustrate the 1960s in particular, rather than to form a comprehensive body of one photographer's work. The Between exhibition presented photography among a selection of contemporaneous media, therefore, which highlighted certain shared sensibilities and motifs between such so-called realist photography or documentary photography and other ostensibly more gestural or plastic media. Seeing these works together in space raised productive tensions in our received histories of genre, style, and media, even at this modest scale. In a short text accompanying the exhibition, I drew attention to the way in which these photographers were working in a realist mode, reflecting one side of the debate between pictorialism and realism that had continued, of course, following the Free Photography exhibition of 1953. Recurring subjects such as water buffalo, children at play, new factories, or the encroachment of modern products and infrastructure spoke to intersecting discourses between legacies of colonial local color and also ostensibly bucolic images of developmentalism under US aid for agricultural development and the limitations of martial law, for example. However, some of these concerns arguably find their echo in a later work of the nativist cultural politics that came to the fore in the 1970s. In the attention given to socioeconomic conditions, colonial legacies, and the lived realities of Cold War alliances, I became more curious with the visual politics that I found resonating between certain images, and whether this was a figure of my curatorial fancy or a condition of some, in quotes, documentary photography under the particular circumstances of Taiwan in its time. There is much that these images do not show. Rather than simply ignoring political reality, I argued that they work to change the subject, by which I was playing on the double meaning of looking for new realities to picture in the realist practices, but also the potential for such picturing itself to assert a subjectivity distinct from that which is superimposed by the state or the geopolitical context. In particular, I became intrigued by the photographs of Cai Huifeng, some of which I've already shown or in the slides thus far, whose work I had featured prominently in the exhibition intuitively, even more so than photographs by better known figures in Taiwan photo history, such as Zhang Shenxi or Deng Nangguan. Cai Huifeng remains relatively little known even in Taiwan and wasn't familiar to me before seeing his work in the National Museum of History collection during the research for this exhibition. And Cai could be seen as somewhat typical, therefore, of a generation of lifelong amateurs who achieved some recognition in the heyday of photo clubs, but only belatedly gained more critical attention and had their work institutionally collected late in life. Here, I'll reflect on how the experience of working with Cai's work curatorially in space points to a kind of vision or visual politics that seems to animate his camera eye. Here, I'm thinking of the potential gap between the contact sheet or photographic practice behind such a body of work, which are often obscured if we focus on discrete or standalone images. I'm interested in the complicated nature of realist or documentary images in the first decades of martial law and the natural tension in which such images seem to hover. In Getting Paid, that you see here on the left, we see workers counting their wages. Their bare torsos and distinct straw hats bear the echo of agricultural labor and suggest that this experience of wages is perhaps a new one. Their sweaty torsos seem to contrast the office environment in which they look out of place. And we could talk more about the framing, the reflections and light, and these sorts of effects, which also create a certain layer of alienation. On the right, in packing chopsticks for extra cash, an elderly woman and young girl, perhaps a grandmother and granddaughter, are packing wooden chopsticks into paper sleeves to earn some extra cash. The Chinese title, which you can see here on the bottom, 卫生筷, Dai Gong. 卫生筷 is literally hygienic chopsticks. So it further emphasizes this sense of modernity that they facilitate, modern hygiene, disposable chopsticks. Like the workers counting their wages, we don't see their faces. There's also a strong contrast in their dress, adding to a sense of lived social transformation, which Cai also frames by the younger girl's prominence and position in frame. Many of Cai's images in the National Museum of History collection, at least from the 60s, focus on such labor as well as sites of industry. There's no sense of heroism. There's no sense of heroism, however. On the contrary, there's often an intense pathos with human toil and harsh or even questionable conditions, including child labor. Tsai photographed major industries like timber, sugar, and the brickworks, but he also captured aspects of Taiwanese life that seemed to be prescient, including the colonial legacies in everyday living, such as this complex image on the right titled Home Life, Jiaju Shenghuo, in which a family lounges on the tatami mat floors of their modest, almost run-down home by eschewing extremes of economic boom or alienating poverty or militarism or politics of some rustic ideal. There's a strong sense of Tsai sharing the space and time of those he photographs, even those laborers he snaps on the fly in his favorite street snapshot approach, which was very much informed by Japanese photography. While I think Tsai's work deserves more attention, my aim is not to focus on his work as unique. On the contrary, I'm struck by how typical his photographic journey is for a certain generation of photographer in Taiwan, the avid amateur of the club scene who only belatedly gains wider recognition. Born in Jiayi in 1928, Tsai had been educated under Japanese colonial rule. He became interested in photography from an uncle who had a fancy German camera, which Tsai coveted. After studying at National University of Taiwan, he was assigned to a factory and bought a camera. And he writes in a later publication for an exhibition that was held at the National Museum of History in 2005. He writes, after graduation, I received a job assignment to work in a state-run enterprise. With a monthly salary, I bought myself an inexpensive camera to play with. Back then, it was not easy to take on a hobby like photography in Taiwan. My learning process was mostly done after work on my own and through trial and error. I also developed my own film and read Japanese photography magazines to acquire knowledge. During this period, I acquainted myself with fellow photographers, and we got together frequently during weekends for outdoor photography sessions. I also sent my works to Japan for monthly photo art contests. And during a period of 3 to 4 years, my pictures were occasionally selected for entry into higher qualification rounds. It was during this time some of my most fundamental skills in photography were developed and sharpened. So I read out this quote because I think it's relatively familiar, I think, for those working on photography of this period and those of Tsai's generation. And it's pretty straightforward. According to Tsai, he continued to see photography as a part-time hobby. Later in life, he became a factory manager, a technical professional, but he would enter his work into group exhibitions around Kaohsiung and Pingtung, the area in which he lived. For the 2005 exhibition at the National Museum of History, he wrote that many of his films from the 1960s had already become moldy and curled and destroyed. So he threw these away and only selected those that were salvageable. Moreover, he squarely positions the work as being of historical value. He writes, in these photos, we can see how the life of average Taiwanese back then was still pretty austere. And I'm interested that he puts the note on austerity because that's something that I think his photography focuses on. It was not until shortly before his death that Tsai approached the National Museum of History himself to ask if they would be interested in mounting an exhibition, which they did. The museum focused on older works from the 1960s, although he continued to photograph. There was an interest in picturing this historical period, bringing to mind comments made by Tsai Jiaoyi from NCPI in this conference about the need to preserve these earlier images. Eventually, the exhibition was held at the museum in 2005, but sadly, Tsai passed away as it was being completed. In the accompanying catalogue, his works are divided according to themes that reflect, I think, a salon framework: snapshots, people and animals, childhood, live street photos, working hard to make a living, and so on. In this catalogue, the individual images illustrate a theme that is historically and socially grounded, but working with Tsai's images, I was struck by the potential to read them as a larger series or a body of work through which there were There seemed to be simmering visual politics beyond the prize images of the photo club. Similarly, a decade later, in the seminal exhibition and catalogue by Jian Yongbing, The Era Scene, or 看见的时代, Jian Yongbing tells a history of photographic development between the 1940s to 70s as a movement from salon-style photography, validated by competitive exhibitions, photo clubs, and coterie journals, to more independent practices featured in irregular self-organized exhibitions, small-run publications, or not circulated at all. In this schema, Cai Huifeng's work features on one page of the catalogue in the section, The Essence of the Photo Club Era. So he's framed within this photo club era of competition and glory, as Jian calls it, of the 50s to the 70s. Interestingly, however, Jian selected a series of Cai's photos that treat a similar subject, the same subject, the pawn shop, which says something specific about Taiwanese society at the time. In doing so, he seems to also highlight the serial nature of the medium and of Cai's original images. Indeed, images 3 and 4 that you see here on the top right and the bottom are exactly the same place, taken in 2 different formats. I'm interested in the way this editorial or curatorial gesture seems to parallel even more radically the reading of Cai's work that I have formed. How might he point to other ways of reading the work of such photographers in this period? This idea was recently reinforced in discussions around this work with a colleague, Gail Newton, who was formerly curator of photography at the National Gallery of Australia. And she was talking about her reflections in an essay for Singaporean photographer Longfatang on the occasion of his exhibition, A Social Portrait of Singapore, held in Singapore in 2015. Gail contrasted the experience of looking over contact sheets of Locke's work compared to the good pictures, usually selected for gallery display. A simple but powerful idea I've used to revisit my curatorial interest in Cai's work. Finally, the short text I wrote for the exhibition was titled Changing the Subject. In it, I argued how photographers working in a realist mode were able to assert new subjectivities precisely through even apparently minor shifts in perspective. Whereas the work of Lang Jinshan and pictorialism often sought to frame a reality that was rooted in a timeless Chinese subjectivity, even as a form of cultural activism, in works such as Cai's, perhaps we see an attempt to not only grasp but propose a subject that is refashioned in the present in the act of photographing, that connects these different frames on the film and the contact sheet, yet seldom at that time in the exhibition or magazine print. Indeed, one term for realist photography in the photo club era was subjective photography, 主观主义的摄影. Perhaps this affords a way of revisiting the work of so-called amateurs such as Cai Huifeng. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krischer, and this introduction to your curatorial practice and projects and philosophies, which I always found a really interesting angle, and for the opportunity to consider more closely Cai Huifeng's as this entry point to his generation. So thank you so much for that.
Let me move to the roundtable discussion. With Abby Chen, Albert Huang, two renowned curators from the United States and from Taiwan. I'm going to introduce Abby and Albert first, and then move to our discussion. Abby Chen is the Senior Associate Curator of the Asian Art Museum, Chongmen Lee Center for Asian Art and Culture, San Francisco. She is also the museum's first head of the Department for Contemporary Art. She holds MA in Visual and Critical Studies from the California College of Arts. She was the artistic director at the Chinese Culture Center of San Francisco from 2006 to 2018, where she held innovative public art and exhibition programs, including Women from 2010 to 2013, and Chinatown Keyword School plus Social Botany, led by Shuxia Chen from 2014-2016. And our next speaker, Albert Huang, is a film director and curator of photography. He received a MFA degree in photography, video, and related media from School of Visual Arts in New York. He is currently the chief curator of Tainan International Photo Festival. He recently curated Emerging Taiwanese Cultural Landscape at the National Center of Photography and Images. So I provided Abby. Abby, could you? Okay, Abby and Albert, the very two big questions, starting with starting with their experience of curating a Taiwanese photography exhibition. Abby, shall we start with yours first?
Sure. Let me share my screen. So when Jihei first approached me about Taiwanese photography, I actually need to go down to the memory lane to start thinking about, okay, what specific Taiwanese photographer that I have been working on, and a lot of times I think that I try to think about all of these Asian identities in a larger context. And so one of the artists that I came across was Patrick Tsai. In 2009, I invited Patrick to be part of the Present Tense Biennial in 2009, hosted at the Chinese Culture Center of San Francisco. And he gave us this series called Neighbors But Strangers. And you can still go to Patrick's Instagram right now, as you can see that he is self-identified as the Taiwanese American photographer based in Japan. And when I first got to learn about his work, he was in China at the time, was just about to go to Japan. And I found his work has this really raw quality that I was very intrigued by. And this is the installation view at the biennial. And those kind of the brutality of being youthful, but also at the same time, the sweet and romantic encounters that he was able to document it, and humor and absurdity in China at the time. But it was very clear at the get-go that he identified himself as Taiwanese American, and even though that he was born in the United States. So he studied film and video at Cal Arts in Los Angeles, and later in Tisch School of Arts in New York. And in 2003, Patrick moved to Taiwan to get closer to his roots. And I would still highly recommend to check out his work. I mean, to this day, I still think that his My Little Dead Dick is really a classic, and it's still there on his website. And so for Present Tense Biennial, it was my first attempt to co-curate the show with two other curators, Kevin Chen and Alan O, in collaboration with Kearney Street Workshop. And that was the cover of the Present Tense poster. And this is the back of the poster. And it has 31 artists reflect on and reinterpret contemporary Chinese culture. And it has artists from different kinds of ethnicity to work with the idea of what it means to be Chinese. And at the time, I think the approach for me to curate and to think about identity is almost like the way that I always think about feminism. That when I look at the artwork, is always a very innate sort of reaction. It's always the work comes first and identity comes later. A lot of times I'm intrigued by the work itself, and then I started to explore and investigate what the trajectory of the artist and why that I myself was intrigued by them. So fast forward, that was 2009, and 2019 I joined Asian Art Museum, and I was curating this show called After Hope, Videos of Resistance. And this time it was a lot more intentional that I want to work with artists from all over Asia and in America, whoever whose work that are really relevant to the understanding of what it means to be Asian today in the world. So there are three notable artists of Taiwanese descent that were in the show. So with Cui Guangyu, Isa Ho, and Yuan Guangming. And the other thing about these three artists is they all have both a video practice, but of course with Yuan Guangming is highly concentrated on video, but with Isa Ho and Cui Guangyu, they both also have a photography practice. And it's important to also introduce the background of After Hope. We invited 60 artists with 54 short videos. So the total length of this entire screening is more than 6 hours. The idea is really to look at all of these issues and the artist's visualization of them in a larger context, together with Palestine, Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, Azerbaijan, all together. And then so Yuan Guangming's work was one of the most intriguing one. And I still remember the first time I actually saw the work was when I was in Japan and in the Mori Museum, that I was watching Yuan Guangming's the 560 61st hours of occupation. And it was around the same time that the young people was also in Hong Kong that trying to get into their legislative council. And it was a completely different type of scenario that the same generation, but having a very different kind of outcome. So it was very important for me to include this work in the After Hope Videos of Resistance. And also Yuan Guangming's work has this strong photographic quality to the way that how he frame and compose his visual effect. And then Isa Ho's work, I've been following Isa Ho's work for a long time. And again, this is a generation of artists that whose practice is very versatile. And Isa Ho does installations, sculpture, photography, videos across many genres. And I picked Peony because this is the work that is about Isa Ho's own investigation into the similarity between K-pop and why it's so popular in Taiwan and in the whole Asian region, but then at the same time how similar certain movements is to Kun opera, Kunqu, the Chinese Kunqu. The work is done again in a very photographic way. There's a lot of shots in the video that almost look like a still photograph and a compilation of still photograph. So that was Isa Ho's work. And at the same time, the Peony is a series that Isa Ho has the video work that she made, but then at the same time, it's also this My Peony Pavilion in response to Tang Xianzu's famous theater piece. And she herself is in her photograph performing her understanding of the pop culture in contrast to a sort of like a opera, a Kun opera still shots. And I find the whole series really intriguing as the pop culture is again missing the identity, the culture identity of of the younger generation, and those kind of like displacement and hybridity of performing an identity in the younger generation. And I think that the Piani series was a very outstanding work. And then I was also following the work of Cui Guangyu, and his work has been kind of disappeared for a while. And I was very actually excited to reconnect with him when I was in Taiwan. And at the time, I was still at Chinese Culture Center, and he was coming to United States on the Asian Cultural Council grant. And the San Francisco, the city of San Francisco is really, I mean, a complicated, but also a very vibrant city, particularly for Asian American, for its political power, for its long history, and also for its polarity of economic conditions. So when Cui Guangyu came over, he actually made this work called Exercise, Living, Stay Calm. Is about his own performance in Chinatown in response to the everyday life of Chinese people over there. And of course, I couldn't help to see the comparison of his fascination with smoke and his interest in the natural landscape when he does photograph. And I just did a screenshot from his website. And as many of you know, Cui Guangyu's work is very much about the urban intervention. And then at the same time, he also had this practice and going to this isolation of nature. And even though the After Hope video of resistance features only video work, it's important to know many of these artists have this dual practice of both video and photography. Oh. I know that today our roundtable have a very short time span, so I do want to keep the presentation really brief so that we can have more time to have the discussion on this new generation of identity discussion. So I just want to quickly give a brief introduction of my curatorial background and practice.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you. I wish I visited the exhibition. I missed them. So now, Albert, could you share your screen and then share your experience with curating Taiwanese photography?
Hello everyone. 好，那我先把我的 screen 叫出来。好，在一开始，我想也顺便回答刚刚有一个问题哈，提到风景为什么会变成地景哈，那我才想到，其实是我在1995年的一个研讨会哈，自然与人文对话，在台湾的一个研讨会里面，我所提出来的说，其实，在那个研讨会里面，在台湾还是使用风景摄影的这样的名词，可是我在那个研讨会里面。其实建议其实是应该使用地景这样的名词可能比较合适。那这个其实也让我开始跟我今天的题目是有关系的哈，也就是从地景。那我的老师哈 Nathan Lyons 他曾经做过一个东西叫 social landscape 哈，是一个社会地景。那我把它再延伸到一个所谓的 cultural landscape 的这样的一个说法哈，或是一个想法，也就是说这样子的一个。所谓的地景其实就是一个拍摄环境这样的东西，其实是有可以非常多功能性的哈，所以它也可以很适合像台湾这样的一个地方，我们在寻求我们自己的文化认同的时候，其实我们是可以使用影像跟照片哈，来协助我们定义台湾的文化，或是台湾人是什么这样的类似的问题哈。所以我们在NCPI 的这个 策展的建议里面，其实我们就是使用了这样的一个题目来做我的策展，就是思考我们的土地跟人的关系。那整个展览基本上是从这个 museum 的 collection 里面来做的那其实就是台湾一直是很缺乏对于自己的认识因为之前基本上都比较认为是中国的延续或中国的一部分可是慢慢的我们对于自身的理解跟自己的文化的主体性的开始思考所以在20世纪末我们开始会去思考这些问题，而且做了一些相关的研究。可是到了21世纪以后，这样的东西反而变成很少了所以我才会当然跟台湾其实没有太多的高等教，就是我们其实并没有专门的一个摄影系有很大的关系所以在我们的之前的研究里面，大部分也都是以摄影家个人的创作为主，而很少去思考什么是整体台湾摄影的脉络不管是作品也好或人也好所以因此我才会大胆的使用这样的一个感觉很大的一个议题事实上在讨论这样的事情。那我想也借由这样的一个展览呢，来拉近研究者，然后拍摄者，那还有大众的一些不同领域跟不同专业的人都可以来面对什么是台湾跟台湾摄影那我觉得基本上就是我们需要做这样的整理所以我就把个人的每个摄影家的这个部分我们先把它不去考量，而去考量一个整体的摄影这件事。所以我就把整个摄影就大概切成了4个不同的面向一个就是所谓的所在那然后就是凭日常然后仪式然后跟走过意思也就是所在当然就是我们所在的环境那也就是台湾这个环境到底是什么东西。那我在这是我们的第一个部分当然使用了许多不同艺术家的作品来呈现可能是中国的留下来的东西，或我们台湾自己想要寻找的东西。那有过去也有现在然后再来就是日常就是我们的日常生活里面我们所看到的大概是什么样的东西那这当然也是从人跟环境互动所产生的不同的结果那当然这个部分等于是在我那个展览里面一个最重要的部分，从日常生活里面去看这些东西。那我可能特别要提醒大家是目前我们所看到的照片的左边这个照片，其实中间的那一位是之前的总统蒋经国先生他在下乡的时候所拍摄的然后再来就是仪式因为我觉得因为台湾有各种不同的族群，那有不同的文化，那仪式就是保留跟延续这些不同文化很重要的部分所以我用仪式这样来当做一个 section 呢，然后来讨论这些不同文化不同族群的人他们使用怎么样的仪式来延续他们对生命跟对生活的看法那这当然也是从旧到今。然后我在最后一个部分呢，就是用走过，因为刚才那些都感觉是比较和平的安详的可是事实上台湾今天走到今天其实是有很多不愉快的或不幸的天灾或人祸的或是有很多人的努力才会有今天的台湾。所以我用走过来当做我的第4个部分呢，来强调这之间我们曾经发生过的，不管是民主运动也好，街头抗议也好，或是台风或是土石流等等这些问题。那基本上呢我所提出的一个概念或者是想法，就是说所谓的台湾文化脉动这件事情，那其实有一个很重要的元素就是我们是从所谓的原住民才是台湾所谓的最早的主人可是在这个过程中其实我们有不同的时代的移民会进来，那这些不同时代的移民某种程度也产生了不同时代的殖民那这些东西其实都造成了这些我把它称为不同世代的在地化也就是说从最早的原住民，然后从荷兰，然后从清朝，从郑成功，然后到日本，然后到国民党政府，然后到现在其实我觉得都是不同世代的在地化。那我觉得这些不同世代的在地化 其实累积出了一个新的所谓的台湾文化这件事情。那当然，正如我们刚刚所看到的，还有现在的很多新住民，还有比如说最近香港也有一些状况，所以香港的人也开始大量的移民或来到了台湾。那这些不同的人都会在台湾产生非常多重要的影响哈。那我觉得像这些东西，其实都是我想在这个展览里面所呈现的哈。那我用很快的把这个东西做成说明以后，我不晓得我的时间如何。
Briefly.
Yeah, very quick. So do I have time for the Tainan International Photo Fest, or I will stop here?
So you want to share the second part of your presentation, which is about Tainan International. Okay.
是的。我有没有时间做这个？还是我先停下来？
Well, if it's brief, it's okay. Yeah, you could share your experience with Tainan International Photo Festival.
OK。那台南国际摄影节哈，其实就是一个
But we don't see your screen. Are you going to share a screen or?
有，我等一下我再处理一下。有看到吗？
No, we don't see your screen. If the question is related to the second part of my question, then I think we better open up our discussion rather than sharing your PPT. So Abby, and
我想我其实是很不一样的，不过我想虽然没有画面，我还是简单的用嘴巴来说一下。台南国际摄影节其实是一个很不一样的事情那它最主要的是在那个地方，就是它是一个比较 local 的一个地方。那怎么样我们把在地的摄影家也培养起来？因为其实并没有那么多的摄影家可以来撑一个整个摄影节哈。所以在摄影节的过程中，其实我们有很大的力气在培养年轻的摄影家的作品，跟肯定资深摄影家的作品从这个不同的逻辑去整理这个台南摄影节所要做的事情。这个是可能跟我在这个 NCPI 的这个展览里面呢，就是已经就是很完整的一些作品里面去呈现其实是有很大的不一样的。所以那个在台南国际摄影节里面，其实我们基本上是有借由各种不同的活动来肯定这些或鼓励年轻的摄影家，或肯定老摄影家，这样同时来进行的。希望借由一些时间来慢慢把这个地方的摄影的风气跟文化培养起来。我简单的叙述到这里。
Okay, thank you. Yeah, but well, because you just mentioned Tainan International Photography Festival, in my presentation today, like I also introduced the photographic exchange between Taiwan and South Korea in the early 1970s and the late 1960s. It was quite interesting for me. The South Korean magazine invited amateur photographers from Tainan to South Korea to show their works, and they published their photographs in their magazine in 1971. And so I introduced some of the pages in my presentation. So so I asked Albert and Abby to share their experience on Taiwanese curating Taiwanese photography. And the second question I asked you was about the issue of diaspora. Well, diaspora was pretty much a shared topic all throughout this 3-day long symposium by many scholars, including myself. I addressed Taiwanese diaspora in South Korea and in Japan, and also like well, for the Korean photography symposium, I intentionally invited Korean American artists as a keynote speaker, almost like from the very beginning, to challenge the idea of like this kind of symposium, pretty much nation-based photographic practices. So I asked you, Albert and Abby, the same question about the issue of diaspora, both in Taiwan and also in the United States, and also the possibility or even your experience of conceptualizing or imagining like trans-Asia and trans-regional theme of exhibition. Maybe you want to go first?
Yeah, actually, you know, when you approached me to talk about Taiwanese photography, my immediate reaction was I never really did a nation-based exhibition before, as I shared with you, and I guess as an immigrant in the United States, it was really the process of becoming an immigrant made me realize the issue of identity and what it means to be diaspora. So I think many times when we have an identity, we try to redefine it, particularly when you're in this kind of like, you know, in a position where you're called an alien. And particularly, I think for Chinese, and it's actually good to, refreshing to see there's a discussion about Taiwanese photography, because I think the refusal to be defined by China or by America as whether it's Asian or Chinese or Taiwanese or Hong Kongese. And I think in a simple word, me as a curator, as you can see in the exhibitions that I have curated, everybody is in a larger context. And it is in that larger context that collectively we define for ourselves, and also that together that we demonstrate this refusal to be defined by a power. So, so that's kind of, when I think about your question, that was my immediate reaction. And the second part is almost like the same way when I think about feminism and when I work with women artists. It's never because they were women or they were Taiwanese or Hong Kong people or anywhere. It's always because that they have this really unique and provocative work that intrigued me, and as a curator. So I really want to know more about that work. I want to share that work. And then you started to realize, oh, you know, there is the identity issue, gender issue behind it. But it's always the work comes first and the analysis comes later. And of course, we could always start to peel out all the layers and trying to look at the background, the creative aspiration and all of that. But it's really because these artists have made amazing work that help us understand the nuance of identity and then lead us in there. So one of the things I think is really important for us to think about is it's artists that created this opening for us to enter the discussion of identity.
Thank you. Albert, you want to make comment on my question?
我的看法可能比较不一样哈，因为我之前在纽约的时候，我可能会比较 从你的角度来思考，就是因为我们人在国外哈，然后来看原本你的母国哈，你的原本的东西是什么，就会思考这些问题，然后是不是有在在不同地方的这些所谓的华人或什么他们对于自己母土的一些思考等等。那可是自从我回到台湾以后，其实我整个思考是不一样的哈，是因为所谓的台湾或台湾文化这个事情是一个还没有被精确定义的，或是大家有共同想法或类似想法的东西。那这个时候其实我比较 focus， 我比较专注在去思考怎么样凝聚大家对于台湾的不同的思考或台湾文化不同的思考与定义。所以我反而就是说我反而是把这个什么是台湾，它这个母体是什么，不管它的人、土地背后的思考、语言等等这些复杂的事情来当做主体。那当然有可能借由离散在各地的不同的台湾人也好，或是对台湾关心的不一定是台湾人，可是他对于台湾议题关心的人也好，把它加入这样的一个东西。所以某种程度上我赞同你的意思，或去做类似的东西，但我思考或是切入的点是完全不一样的。这是我简单的回答。
Because well, the very reason I brought up this issue is because like even for the Korean photography symposium, like these diaspora community is doubly marginalized. So Min Young-soon shared her own experience of marginalized both in the United States, but at the same time, whenever she would try to engage with Korean artists, like artists from Korea, because well, her citizenship is American. So I also see like the Taiwanese diaspora, both in South Korea and in Japan, they're also pretty much doubly marginalized. They are discriminated in South Korea and also in the Japanese society, but they are also very acknowledged in Taiwan itself, especially 60s and 70s and 80s. Like it's also quite interwoven with the geopolitics of the region of East Asia, and also pretty much like the relationship between each country with the United States as well. Like as I noted in my talk, like a lot of Taiwanese diaspora in South Korea, because they couldn't endure the hardship of life in South Korea, they migrated to the United States in the 1970s. So they're pretty much like doubled, tripled diaspora communities all the way from South Korea, sometimes to via Japan, and then all the way up to the United States. And also like, I think probably this might be the very first symposium on photography in Taiwan. Like there have been a lot of events, workshops, conferences on Chinese photography, and slightly including one or two speakers from Taiwan, where Taiwanese photography is a part of like greater China Chinese photography. But I try to deviate from that frame, like differentiate all the different layers of Taiwanese photographic practice, very different from Chinese experience. And Lulu Ho shared her experience in the United States in Chinatown. Like when she introduced her as Chinese, like the Chinese people immediately corrected her. No, you are Taiwanese, you are not Chinese. So like this kind of experience, like even like I try to push further Qianqi Chang in the session with Hong Zhan and Lulu, like his Chinatown project, like Chinatown, where which might be pretty much bifurcated, as Hong Zhan noted. So like Taiwanese experience in Chinatown, and I intentionally pulled up two photographs by Benjamin Chin from the Center for Creative Photography, the 1940s Chinatown in San Francisco. So that was exactly 1949 when the Chinese Civil War ended. and that was like the Republic of China was like what came to gain polity and was born. So like for me, it was very, very significant images to think of like the sort of like diverging imaginary of being Taiwanese and being Chinese, and also diasporic communities throughout East Asia, like in South Korea, like the Chinese diaspora, they chose ROC citizenship immediately following the end of the Chinese Civil War, or they had to leave the country. So so then like even for like for Abby and Albert, like are you, I mean, have you also experienced this kind of like complex or dilemma of artists identifying themselves Taiwanese or even refusing to choose their own identity? Well, could be Chinese or could be Taiwanese or just American.
As I said just now, a lot of my curating is really about the refusal to be defined by power, whether it's the power of China or the power of America. And also, I think as an immigrant myself, this rapidly shifting geopolitical environment and its impact on an individual, I think is what causing us to be so, what's the word? To be so persistent on thinking about this issue, because I think the power always want to pin you down as one identity or as a very monolithic identity. And our job as cultural workers is to constantly do our best to refuse to be fixated and to change that dominant narrative. And because our environment is constantly shifting, just like what Albert said, that when he was in America, he was thinking about the Taiwanese photography probably in one kind of lens. And then by the time he go back to Taiwan, he would look at it in a different way. When it's all shifting and all over the place, you kind of want to pin it down and group them together. But when you started to realize that they're being grouped together, then you started want to really break it apart. And so I think it's this constant negotiation and constant shifting that continue to push the work forward. And I feel like as the environment changed, and just look at Hong Kong. I mean, I think for a very long time that we were not really paying that much attention to the art of Hong Kong. But I think particularly in the past 10 years, we started to see some of the most outstanding work that coming out of Hong Kong because that environment has changed and how the world is contextualizing Hong Kong has changed. So I think we're actually getting into an even more rapidly changing landscape globally right now. So the topic of identity and how we curate and theorizing identity is shifting very rapidly as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Albert?
好，其实正如我所说的哈，我其实是很亲身体验的这些不同的经验，因为其实在我从小的受到的教育里面，就是所谓的大中国或者大中华的教育，我们必须认同我们是中国的一部分。那当然，因为我整个创作都一直在思考这个文化认同的部分，所以不管我后来到美国，或是我最后又回到了台湾哈，其实也一直是在这个东西挣扎哈。其实我个人的认同就是一直在不同的变化哈。那我觉得其实回答你这个问题，我觉得会从2个方面来看也就是说，对于台湾我们自己国内哈，因为其实台湾国内就有不同的认同上面所造成的差异，那也会造成政治上或是各种看法上的不同，所以我觉得在我们对于国内的怎么样把认同这件事情做到一个最大的公约数，让我刚才所提到的不同世代的在地人 不同世代的在地化这件事情能够真正的在地化。那我觉得这就是一种共生因为台湾真的开始吸纳很多来自于不同地方的人，那这些不同的地方的人有没有办法在台湾好好的活下来，而且被尊重的活下来？那我觉得这个是很重要的。所以这个是关于对内，我们台湾人不要再有某一个族群比较强势，某一个族群比较弱势这件事情，让台湾内在的不同的族群之间能够彼此尊重，然后不管在创作上、在文化上，还有政治权利上。那另外一个角度呢，就是所谓的对外，就像各位今天我们会有，我很高兴，我们第一次看到有一个台湾摄影研讨会，我听到这个名词，我其实是兴奋到不晓得该怎么形容哈。所以不管我搞不清楚我能够扮演什么样的角色，所以我收到邀请我就先接受了哈。因为台湾摄影从前是一个从来没有被讨论过的题目我们台湾摄影是什么？连台湾摄影在台湾都不一定被讨论，那竟然有一个知名的大学、知名的研究所要来讨论台湾摄影，那表示我们已经走出来了，已经某种程度上在国际舞台上，台湾已经被看到了。其实这个在之前台湾是很少被看到的，或是台湾在被看到的时候，都是一种不好的形象才会被看到的，什么在吵架啦，什么杀动物啦，反正就做一些不好的事，才会在国际舞台上被看到。所以我们怎么样在国际舞台上继续的让台湾这件事情的能见度可以被提高，而且不管正面负面，我觉得我们现在已经没有那个好像说一定要用正面的角度来看这个地方，我觉得我们现在已经更有自信的面对不同的人，用不同的角度来看台湾这件事情。所以台湾现在从一个原本被丢在角落不被注意的事情，变成了现在有人说是全世界最危险的地方来到了一个世界舞台的中心。我觉得某种程度上也代表我们这些人的努力慢慢的被不同的人看到，所以我对这个问题是有对内跟对外两个不同的看法与想法。谢谢。
Thank you. Well, I have a final question to Albert, because you are the curator of Tainan International Photography Festival, and you mentioned that you are trying to help the local photographer in the festival. So throughout the 3-day-long symposia, I noticed that, including myself, there's very little discussion of because Taiwan is multi-ethnic country, so like the indigenous voices, like indigenous aboriginal people or indigenous people as an object of photography rather than as subject of photography, like as the producer of photography. So in your photo festival, or even in your curatorial experience, do you engage with this kind of endeavor to help indigenous groups of or community play their role as producer of image?
其实我觉得这是一个很好的问题，可是也不能够太急那其实在这个部分，我觉得台湾因为现在有在原住民的部分，当然我不是这个领域的专家，我只能就我的理解来做一些讨论。有原民电视台，有原民的这个电台radio station， 那还有当然很多的努力，所以我觉得就是在目前台湾的做法，其实就是把这个养分做出来，让他们自己来成长。那当然在我所教过的学生里面也有一些原住民的身份的，那他们也自己在慢慢，因为其实在台湾作为原住民，其实有一点像之前我所讲到的，身为台湾人在世界上有一点像，就是原本在台湾原住民这件事，他们会否认自己是原住民的，因为他们觉得其实是在之前大家其实用比较不好的角度来看原住民，所以明明是原住民的人，他不敢承认自己是原住民的身份。那到了这20几年来，其实慢慢这件事情已经消失了，大家其实是肯定自己有原住民的身份的。那这个肯定自己的身份以后，然后我觉得才会有下一步，肯定自己的身份以后，才用这个身份来创作。所以我觉得这个事情也不可能太急，可是我觉得就是尽量给他们不同的资源，让他们自然的成长。像我们也拍了很多纪录片，虽然我们是一个 旁观者，那他们是主体。可是其实在整个互动的过程中，我觉得被看的人跟看的人，我自己不觉，当然这可能是我自己的私心，我觉得并没有那么大的不一样。其实假如是我们在拍摄的人也是用同等的尊重的角度，其实不一定就一定要原住民的人才能来拍原住民，其实只是看我们这些拍摄者或工作者有没有足够的尊重跟同理心来面对你所拍摄的人。那我觉得这是一样的，是从两个不同的方向来进行。谢谢。
Thank you so much. Like, because even in the United States, recently there have been a lot of endeavors to establish or to help like the Native Americans and its heritage as part of our bigger project of rewriting and decolonizing the discipline of art history and even the history of photography. So even this symposium and the previous symposium on Korean photography is all shared endeavor to decolonize and diversify the field of photography and the history of photography, and also acknowledging the necessity to rewrite or even correct the way we've been writing the history of photography. Probably like when we say like global photography or global art history, that we have to acknowledge like this kind of like marginalized and always forced to be invisible in the bigger picture of the writing art history and history of photography. So thank you so much, Abby and Albert, to share your experience of curating and your thoughts and insights on the very two big questions and also about the symposium itself. So now we're moved toward the end, very finale at the end of the symposium. So Meg will introduce our speaker of giving his closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kim. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Simpf, who is the Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography. And just before I hand it over to her, I'd like to just congratulate Dr. Kim again for a second wonderful, dynamic, incredibly important symposium, and what an absolute honor it is to partner with you. And I am so excited for the symposiums that are in our future together and all the other projects I hope that are to come. And as well as thank you to all of our participants and audience who were here. What a wonderful 3 days this has been. And I'm sad to see it come to an end, but excited for the conversations that will continue as a result and branch from this moment. And with that, Dr. Simpf is the Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona here in Tucson. Her BA in art history is from the University of Arizona. Her MA and PhD were awarded by Boston University in 2012. In Boston University. And then in 2012, her book, Reconstructing the View, the Grand Canyon Photographs of Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe, was released by the University of California Press. In 2017, her book, To Be 13, showcasing the work of Betsy Schneider, was published by Radius Press and Phoenix Art Museum. Dr. Simpf is an Ansel Adams scholar with a book forthcoming on with a book that's just been published on Ansel Adams' early years called Making a Photographer, co-published by the CCP and the Yale University Press. And with that, Becky, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Meg. So as Meg said, my name is Rebecca Simpf, and I work as Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona in Tucson. I have the great pleasure of offering a few brief closing remarks for this 3-day symposium, Photography in Taiwan, History and Practice. First, I have the honor of sharing gratitude and appreciation for the many individuals and institutions who made this symposium the success it was. We thank the Ministry of Culture in Taiwan and the Taiwan Academy of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Los Angeles for their support of the 2022 Taiwan Spotlight Grant Program of the Taiwan Academy. We thank the University of Arizona, Arizona Arts Division, and specifically Colin Blakely and Dr. Ji-Hae Kim of the School of Art. We thank the Center for Creative Photography, its Associate Curator of Academic and Public Programs, Dr. Meg Jackson-Fox, and the Center's financial supporters, including its members and Directors Circle. We thank the talented translators whose work opens the symposium to a wider audience. And we thank all the participants who've generously shared their time, their expertise, and their attention. We also appreciate the audience for making this a sharing opportunity. I want to call particular attention to Dr. Kim's vision in conceiving this symposium conducted in virtual space that allows for an international convening of artists, scholars, institutions, and communities. The exchange of ideas and the connecting of people many time zones apart has the powerful impact of creating opportunities for learning, for considering things from new perspectives, and for appreciating the echoes and similarities between varied bodies of knowledge. For instance, I found it particularly poignant to hear Chow Yi Sai of the National Center of Photography and Images during the first session describe the museum, its building renovation, and its collecting. As the chief curator of the Center for Creative Photography, which is about to celebrate its 50th anniversary in 2025, it was fascinating to hear how a newer institution has approached defining itself. Dr. Kim's insightful question about the institution's name pointed at the myriad considerations and nuanced thought that goes into creating centers that are meant to preserve, provide access, and interpret our fascinating medium. I also appreciate the ways in which a symposium such as this creates valuable opportunities for expanding art historical canons and discourse. Opening the door to bring scholars and artists together offers the chance to rethink how we tell stories, provides meaningful insight into research happening right now, and encourages us to see photography as the multifaceted global medium it is, including its many histories, audiences, contexts, collections, and interpretations. With that, I hope that people have had lots of fruitful moments in the days and months ahead, reflecting on their experiences here, and find that the value of their participation carries forward in their professional lives, as I know it will for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. Well, I'd like to thank everyone, especially Meg Jackson-Fox, Dr. Fox. Without your help, this symposium could not be realized. And I really, really appreciate your help and support throughout the process, you know, the long process of negotiation and inviting these wonderful scholars and artists and curators from Taiwan and also from the United States. And I'd like to thank all the speakers and panelists for your wonderful talks and sharing your thoughts. And I really love to have, like, if it's in person, like to have spicy beef noodle, like Hongsha Niuro Mian. But next time when I visit Taipei, we could have the noodle together. Thank you, and also for the audience, thank you so much for joining us, especially for those who's joining all the 3-day events. So I hope you have a great night here in Arizona and also on the East Coast, and also have a great afternoon in Taipei. And please, I'd like to also remind you that this is a series. So I hope we could continue our endeavor to move on to Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia to convince scholars and curators again. Thank you so much, and have a good night and have a good afternoon. And especially thank the interpreters. You guys are so wonderful. Thank Wanxiang and Shuhan. Thank you so much, and have a good night.